Our next speaker is Dr. David Shapiro, who, uh-oh.
I was ready to take on John. Man, David, which?
Whatever you two decide, let me know.
I'm just gonna let it settle down.
Yeah. John has been given the designation as being the one person more opinionated than Nick Cummings, for better or for worse. And he tends to stir something up. Even when you agree with 90% of what he says, there's always that 10 where you go, but he does make us all think. Dr. David Shapiro, our next speaker, is a forensic psychologist and professor at Nova Southeastern University. He teaches such things as forensic assessment, criminal law, professional ethics. He's working on a research on a new inventory, the Power and Control Inventory, which he'll be talking about, and I believe has copies out in the lobby for those who are interested. He is a prolific writer and practitioner. He consults on criminal and civil cases, has been involved in assessing risk for violence, neuropsychological screenings, and a number of other issues. Most importantly, he has the privilege of being married to Lenore Walker. So welcome, David Shapiro.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you all. Good. I'm going to have a somewhat different approach. I'm going to spend some time with you on some research regarding risk assessment. Now, you might say, why is risk assessment relevant to these issues? Well, we're talking about not only domestic violence, but who is it that perpetrates domestic violence? Is there a way of identifying those who will perpetrate domestic violence in the future? This is the whole area of what we call risk assessment. And as I was thinking about this and thinking about the theme of this conference, broken family courts, it occurred to me that one of the things that goes on when we talk about risk assessment, we talk about perpetrators of domestic violence, is that there is an underlying assumption that we really know who it is, the types of people that do perpetrate domestic violence. In fact, as I hope to demonstrate to you, very little is known about this population. The research in this area is pathetic. It is very, very limited. Janet did mention I'm trying to do some research in the area. I have developed what I call the Power and Control Inventory. I have copies of it out on the table in front. Please feel free to help yourself to it. It is in the process of being validated. Anybody who works with batterers who would like to help me develop some validation data, please pick it up, use it, send me your results. I would really like to have that. But when we talk about this whole idea of violence risk assessment in family law matters, I'm reminded of a law professor with whom I've worked over the past several years. Some of you may know a law professor by the name of Michael Perlin. Michael Perlin has developed a concept called pretextualism. In pretextualism is pervasive throughout the mental health law area. We go under the pretext that we have well-trained evaluators using well-validated instruments to give informed decisions to the courts regarding the best interests of the child. In fact, none of those assumptions are true. And yet we keep going, and this is one of the many reasons that I think that the system is broken, because we go on these pretexts and just reinforce these pretexts over and over again that we have valid instruments, that we're making valid determinations that are of value to the court. I want to give a very, and I said before, we are really at a point, we're trying to start some research. The research up to this point is really very poor. The whole area, the whole idea about assessment of violence is, believe it or not, of fairly recent origin. Some of you may know this. Prior to, say, about 1985, assessment of violence was done purely on a clinical basis. Someone would sit down, talk to somebody, and come up with a conclusion as to whether or not this person was potentially violent. At that point, it was also actually called prediction of dangerousness, whatever dangerousness was. A researcher by the name of John Monahan in the early 1980s started publishing some very disturbing research, or actually what we call now meta-analyses, showing that clinicians were in fact wrong 2 out of 3 times in their assessments of the potential for violent behavior. That we were absolutely very poor in our ability to predict violent behavior. Monahan became the principal investigator for a large-scale research project under the auspices of the MacArthur Foundation, which lasted for about 20 years and accomplished a large number of things, much too detailed for me to go into. But one of the things they came up with were to expand the range of predictor and criterion variables, predictive variables. Before, it was just a clinical interview. Ultimately, the MacArthur Foundation research identified 5 different areas in which these parameters that needed to be taken into effect: demographic, sociological, psychological, biological, and contextual variables. And they studied each one of these areas. They ultimately came up with 38 different domains that they said were relevant to violence risk assessment. There was also then a conceptual shift away from prediction of dangerousness to how much risk is involved when you look across all these parameters. One of the very controversial areas was the role of mental illness in this. What ultimately came out of this and other research were several different approaches to the assessment of violent behavior. One we've already talked about, the purely clinical approach. Secondly, there started developing towards the late 1980s into the mid-1990s what we call the actuarial assessment of violent behavior. This is where certain static, fixed factors, such as whether or not somebody grew up in an intact household, whether or not there was substance abuse in the family, whether there was evidence of maladjustment in the early school years. These were taken as static variables, entered into an actuarial equation, and out of this allegedly came a predictive variable of how likely this person was to be violent. Some people who were uncomfortable with that went to what they called an adjusted actuarial, where they would modify some of these variables in terms of clinical insights. And finally, the most recent approach is what is called structured professional judgment. Structured professional or structured clinical judgment is where you take, say, an area of research like the MacArthur research. Say it identified 38 areas that need to be looked at. You use those as a kind of a guide, as a way of structuring your evaluation. Make sure you cover all of these different areas. But then within each of the areas, you can use your clinical judgment to pursue different leads. So it's a sort of a guideline. Now, one of them, for instance, is called the HCR, which stands for Historical, Clinical, and Risk Factors. And interesting, all of these schemes, and I'm going to come back to this later, had the concept of psychopathy involved. The psychopath, the person who is cunning, manipulative, cannot learn from experience, has no empathy. This was a group of individuals that in every one of these predictive schemes seemed to be very heavily weighted in terms of the prediction of violent behavior. Now, the question is, how much of this is relevant, if at all, to assessment of domestic violence? Well, the sad thing is not great, okay? None of these schemes really hold up very well when you're trying to assess the potential for domestic violence. About 5 or 6 years ago, there was the first attempt to do an actuarial assessment of the potential for domestic violence. And this was the what was called DVRAG, the Domestic Violence Risk Assessment Guide. And I'm not going to cover all of the things. I've got many more slides than I can talk about. So let me just highlight a few things. And first of all, one of the things I would like you folks please, I'm sorry? Okay, yeah. One of the things, please, I would like you to keep in mind for future discussion as I go through these variables, and these are regarded as not based on clinical judgment, but actually correlated with recidivism, with domestic violence recidivism. Please think of your own practices. Please think of the people with whom you have been in contact, both in terms of perpetrators and victims, and ask yourself, do these factors really seem to be relevant? Okay. Now, what this instrument has, okay, again, I'm not going to go in detail over them, but it's got 4 items that deal with prior history of assault, whether or not the person has been sentenced to incarceration, and whether or not they have failed when they've been on conditional release. They've got 1 item involving threats to harm or kill the victim, 1 item about confining them, actually imprisoning them within a home or other facility. 2 areas having to do with children, the number of children between that the perpetrator and the victim had together, and then the number of the victim's children from prior relationships. Whether there is violence in other relationships outside of the victim and the perpetrator. Interestingly, that is the dimension, the parameter that is most highly weighted in this domestic violence risk assessment guide. Whether or not there's substance abuse, whether or not there was an assault while the woman was pregnant, and the number of barriers to victim support. In other words, did they live in an isolated area? Were there phone or internet connections such that the woman could be in contact with other people? And again, finally, the score on the psychopathy checklist. So all of those different variables, and you can see each one has a classification, you know. If it's not applicable, gets a 1, you know, or a score of 0. And each of them has a weight assigned to it. Add up all the weights, you come out, put the weights into a formula, and you come out with a predictive value of the potential for domestic violence. So again, maybe we can discuss this later on, but I'd like you to think of these things, again, in terms of whether these really make sense in terms of your practice. An example, which is a risk assessment instrument called the SARA, S-A-R-A, which stands for Spousal Assault Risk Assessment. Now, batteries, okay, good. Now, The SARA is an example not of an actuarial instrument, but of one of these. It is one of these structured professional judgment instruments. So in other words, the variables here are those that have been shown by the research to be relevant to the potential for domestic violence. How you inquire about that is up to your clinical judgment and your clinical skills. So it has 2 items dealing with past assault. One assault of family, one assault of strangers, past violation of conditional release. 2 items having to do with relationship and employment problems, one having to do with being a victim of or a witness to family violence when growing up, item dealing with substance abuse, another item dealing with suicidal or homicidal ideation, one dealing with psychotic symptoms, another dealing with personality disorder symptoms characterized by anger, impulsivity, and behavioral instability. 4 items having to do with physical assault, sexual assault, and whether weapons were used and whether there were credible threats of death involved, and whether there were violation of no contact orders. Another dimension has to do with whether or not there was a recent escalation with either severity or frequency. And then finally, 2 items having to do with an individual who minimizes or denies their assault history, and then attitudes that support or condone assault. And of course, this gets into a lot of the stuff that I'll talk about in a moment, having to do with some of the research on the power and control inventory. So that is the SARA. These are attempts at domestic violence instruments. I'm sorry to say they're not really great. Another recent approach has been from a researcher by the name of Jacqueline Campbell. Some of you may know Dr. Campbell's work. She takes a rather interesting approach, and in Jacqueline Campbell's research, she says that the woman's perception of how serious the threat is, or how credible the threat is the single most important variable in determining the severity of possible abuse. In other words, the woman's subjective perception of danger, which, as you can see, does not appear in any of these other risk assessment schemes. But Jacqueline Campbell's work puts a lot of focus on the woman's subjective perception. She says it's the best single predictor of reassault, and when abuse has been documented, it is the best single predictor of lethality. That is, that the perpetrator will act out and actually kill the woman. It's her assessment instrument, Dr. Campbell's assessment instrument, is broken into 3 parts. In the first part, there is a rating of the different kinds of assaults, all the way from slapping and pushing, all the way up to the use of a weapon so seriously that it causes actual injury. Part 2, pardon me, I'm trying to read my notes under bad light here. The woman who fills this out is asked to respond yes or no to whether there is physical assault that increases, physical violence that increases in severity and frequency, whether there's choking, possession of guns, forced sex, use of street drugs, daily threats to kill. Part 3, yes or no to whether the perpetrator tries to control their daily activities. Are there beatings while she's been pregnant? Pervasive problems of jealousy, either threatened or attempted suicide on the part of the perpetrator. You know, if you don't go along with this, I'll kill myself. And whether there's been violence to the children. Now, this is the most interesting part of Dr. Campbell's research, some of the statistics. What she does is to add up all of these different categories. The average woman who, if there is such a thing, or say the prototypical victim of abuse, scores somewhere about a 3 on those, will endorse about 3, maybe slightly more of those items. If there is a score of 4 or greater, it is regarded of great risk, and of a score of 8 or greater, lethal risk. So, and now, there are also some interesting statistics that come from the Department of Justice. If the woman is threatened or assaulted with a gun, the possibility of a violent death it's 20 times more likely if there's threatened or an actual assault. If she is threatened with a gun, but there's no actual assault, 15 times as likely. If the perpetrator chokes her, 10 times as likely. If there is pervasive jealousy, 9 times. Forced sexuality, 8 times. Possession of a gun, 6 times as likely. Okay, and I just wanted to make reference that according to Dr. Campbell's research, 30% of the cases involving domestic violence that lead to actual death were murder-suicides, 30%. And as Dr. Walker mentioned, she and another one of our colleagues at NOVA are trying to do some research in this area. I can't recall if you mentioned that South Florida has the dubious distinction of being the highest in the nation in terms of murder-suicides. So, okay. So, I'm sorry? Oh, she did say that. Okay. Okay. I'm running short on time, so there were a number of other violence risk assessment schemes. One called the DOVE, D-O-V-E, which breaks it down into 19 variables. I won't go into these in any detail, primarily, well, because of the lack of time, but also a lot of them seem to cover the same dimensions. Dr. Johnson, Janet Johnson, has got 9 predictor variables. One of the interesting areas, the police department in the city of Nashville, Tennessee, circulates a domestic violence risk assessment sheet, if you will, for people who are victims of domestic violence, to help identify, to help structure interventions. They identify a dimension of that hasn't been covered in the rest of these, a sense of narcissism and entitlement on the part of the perpetrator. Interesting that a police department, of course, we will assume that they had psychological consultants that helped them come up with that dimension. But that does interface with a lot of the stuff that you'll see, again, hopefully, if you pick up this power and control inventory. Just a word about it. This is some research that I'm currently involved in. I'd love to have you help me with it. It basically covers the following dimensions: emotional control, discipline, financial control, isolation, sense of authority, sense of insecurity, substance abuse, and sexual jealousy. I also, knowing the population we're dealing with, I also have incorporated into this what I call a fake good scale, because none of these guys are going to say, yes, I do all of these things. So, you know, I have incorporated what I call a fake good scale. In conclusion, let me just make a few remarks. First of all, domestic violence risk assessment has to be an ongoing dynamic process. The idea of doing it just at one point and resting on those results is just not going to work. So that really throws the whole idea of an actuarial assessment somewhat up in the air, because actuarial assessments are static variables by definition, variables that do not change. When you get into treatment, obviously one size does not fit all. There are different kinds of domestic violence. There are different kinds of batterers. There are different kinds of treatments, if at all. The interesting thing, this dimension of psychopathy, which is so central to all of the other risk assessment schemes, does not seem to be that relevant in the assessment, the prediction of domestic violence, with one possible exception. Those of you who are familiar with the research know about the work of Jacobson and Gottman, perhaps in the 1990s, am I right? Where they identified the two, I'm sorry? Late 80s, okay. They identified the two kinds of batterers, the cobras and the pit bulls. You know, the pit bulls who just sort of explode and act out violently, and then the cobras who sort of lay in wait for their victims. The cobras seem to be a fairly small percentage. Very often there are combinations of the two, but perhaps the concept of the cobra bears some relationship to the concept of the psychopath. So I come back to my initial point about the fact that in the domestic violence area, by not knowing the literature, by not having good research literature, by not having good normative data, we as mental health professionals are contributing to that pretextualism, the pretext that we're doing something meaningful, the pretext that we have competent evaluators using well-normed instruments. We don't. We need to work on them. Thank you very much.